On behalf of Glaukos, we'd like to thank the residents, fellows, and attendings of teaching institutions around the U.S. for joining us today and welcome you to the FDA-Approved Cross-Linking Clinical Protocols webinar. My name is John Bogosian, and I'd like to pass along some relevant information ahead of the start of our program. We want to ensure your questions are answered and have enabled the Q&A function, which can be found at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please feel free to submit your questions at any time during the webinar, and the speakers will aim to answer them at the end. Because we are using the Q&A function, the chat function will be disabled. In summary, please use the Q&A function and not the chat function to submit questions. For reference, note that this webinar is being recorded so that we can make this information more accessible. Also, following the webinar, we will be sending certificates of attendance to all those who are logged on this evening. I'm pleased to introduce the speakers of this webinar. Joining us today are clinical and reimbursement experts, Jason Brill, Clinical Application Specialist, and Tim McSweeney, Director, Field Reimbursement. Jason Brill has 13 years of clinical keratoconus experience to provide support, training, and surgical assistance to cornea and refractive specialists. In his current role as U.S. Clinical Specialist, he works on-site with surgeons and staff on FDA-approved cross-linking protocols, operation of the KXL system, as well as pre- and post-op clinical concerns. Tim McSweeney has over 20 years of experience in the market access field and currently serves as the Director of Field Reimbursement for Glaukos. Tim's vast experience has led to commercial coverage for FDA-approved corneal cross-linking, expanding exponentially over the last several years. A majority of patients in the U.S. now currently have coverage for FDA-approved cross-linking, with over 95% of commercial lives being covered. Without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Jason Brill.
Okay, thanks, John. Welcome, everybody. I'd like to start off to say that the cross-linking has been approved in the United States since 2016. It was brought to us as the KXL system through Avedro. In late last year, late 2019, Avedro was acquired by Glaukos. So you'll hear me kind of go back and forth with the nomenclature in this program, but you may hear it on the podium or in peer reviews. The Avedro KXL system and the Glaukos iLink system are the approved, FDA-approved cross-linking systems. They're approved as progressive keratoconus and corneal ectasia following a refractive procedure. Keratoconus, of course, somewhat onsets in the early teen ages through the late 50s. It was the #1 diagnosis for transplant, and that has fallen off since the advent of the approval for cross-linking. But keratoconus, of course, a thinning progressive disease of the cornea causing the cornea to misshape. We thought maybe there was a family history. There is somewhat of a family history, less outstanding than what we originally believed, but certainly brought on by eye rubbing, allergies, blurred vision, distorted images, increased astigmatism, certainly the Myers-Ring, Munson syndrome. All these are signs of keratoconus. The post-float on your topographer starts to get more steep. The chemistry changes, cylinder changes, of course, are an indication. But for sure, when you look at the keratometric map, that starts to get decentered and certainly progressive and steeper. The Myers would certainly become more asymmetric as the keratoconus worsens in these patients. But that's one thing to diagnose keratoconus. Certainly another to go back to the progression, the labeled indication of progression of keratoconus. So we allowed patients into our study who fit the progressive disease of an increase of a diopter of steep K over 24 months, an increase of a diopter of manifest cylinder over that same time, or half a diopter and change of spherical equivalent. So these all sound like a definition of keratoconus, but more so to say progression. And many of the carriers have also cut and pasted these definitions into their payer policy. To talk more specifically about cross-linking, 3 ingredients of cross-linking are, of course, the drug, riboflavin in this case, UV light, and oxygen, to saturate the stroma and cause a biochemical response within all those stromal fibers. And more specifically, the collagen that encases all those fibers will become much more rigid and stronger to stave against the effects of this progressive disease. However, of course, the epithelium is very good at blocking all these 3 ingredients, so we simply remove the epithelium. It becomes a PRK, if you will, at that point. The epithelium will regrow, but it allows all of those ingredients to enter into the stroma. The aim of cross-linking, of course, is to stop that progression of the disease. It's not a refractive procedure, it shouldn't be billed as such. There could be a refractive benefit, we find, but the goal, of course, is stopping the progression of the disease so that those patients will most likely stay in fairly close to their same prescription, but certainly stay in their contact lens or spectacles or whatever they use preoperatively. There aren't any contraindications with this procedure. It was studied between the ages of 14 to 65, so efficacy hasn't been showed outside of those ranges. It is off-label for pregnant or breastfeeding women. However, on that point, it's completely safe for pregnant technicians. It's not a laser. There's no irradiation. Early intervention is the key to preserving vision. There's a long history of stabilization and efficacy. When you're talking to your referring physicians and patients, this is the only FDA-approved procedure to maintain that patient in their stable contact lens fit. Keep in mind also when you're speaking to your physicians, but also from an internal perspective from your office, there is no global period for this procedure. So you bill every office visit, every post-op visit as an office visit. But your referring optometrist should know that as well. When you refer the patients back to them, they'll still bill that keratoconic vision or visit. These patients are always going to be a KC patient. They're still going to bill that as a specialty visit, as a specialty lens, post-operatively. Let's see if I can advance. Okay, so let's talk about the procedure. As I mentioned, it was approved as both a drug and a device. So let's talk about the drug. 1 kit per eye. We can talk about bilateral, very unusual for a bilateral procedure, but 1 kit per eye. It is shipped cold. Keep it in the refrigerator. You can return the shipping, the insulated shipping container back to us. We'll reuse that, but reacclimate it back to room temperature before the procedure. It includes 2 drug formulations, 2 Photrexa formulations, 1 Photrexa viscous there in the orange label. That's what's used to saturate the cornea. That's what's used by the techs most of the time during the procedure. The green label formula is a hypotonic formula to swell the cornea intraoperatively if the patient calls for it, if the patient's cornea is too thin. It also includes the activation card for the device, which we'll talk about shortly. But some other supplies to be ready for the procedure to include on the tray: lid speculum, 4x4s, wax, BSS, Tegaderm, and whatever you're going to use whatever your preference is for removing the epithelium. So whether that's, I think I have it on it, whatever your preference is for removing the epithelium. So if that's alcohol well, a 9mm alcohol well, as seen here on this tray, the Tegaderm is there, speculum, wax, certainly the 4x4s are there. This surgeon prefers the alcohol well, but you can use an Amoyal's brush. You can use an Orca well or an Orca blade, or simply loosen up the epithelium with your standard tetracaine regimen. And I see a lot of times just scraping at the slit lamp. So whatever your protocol is for removing the epithelium for a PRK, that's what we'll do here. This is the Dresden protocol, so epi off, a 30-minute riboflavin soak followed by 30 minutes under the light, continuing with the drops. So that's it in a nutshell. We'll talk about specifics as we go forward. But oh, here we go. So whatever your post-op, your PRK preference is for removing the epithelium, we'll remove the epithelium to a 9mm debridement. After that, it could be the technician or whoever, it could be you as a surgeon, it could be the technician to soak the cornea. 1 drop every 2 minutes for 30 minutes of the Photrexa viscous riboflavin formulation. And that's what we looked at earlier with the orange label. After 30 minutes, we're going to do 2 intraop tests, and one is to check for flare at the slit lamp to ensure that the stroma is properly and sufficiently saturated. But also we're going to check the pachymetry. The magic number is 400 microns. We want the cornea to be 400 microns at least before we start the UV light. If it's not 400, we can swell it to 400 with the supplied hypotonic drug. That's a much more frequent drug. It's actually a frequent drop. It's actually a much more fluid drop. 2 drops every 10 seconds, and maybe recheck the pachymetry at 2 minutes. Once we get to that 400 micron thickness, reintroduce the speculum, align the device centrally over the cornea, and start the UV irradiation. Continuing with the 1 drop every 2 minutes for 30 minutes of the Photrexa viscous, that's the drug in the orange label. Continue with the Photrexa viscous while under the UV irradiation. So to talk about aligning the device, once the cornea is properly saturated and you have at least 400 microns thickness, align the crosshair devices. Right there in the top right of the screen, there's a cross and an X. When those centers come together, that's the proper focal length. It's 5 centimeters, about 4 finger lengths from the bridge of the nose. But once those come together, that's the proper focal length. Center on the cornea, start UV treatment, and you'll see that 9mm green UV light. That's what you as the surgeon or the technician will keep centered on the cornea using a supplied remote control. Keep that centered on the cornea while continuing with 1 drop every 2 minutes for 30 minutes of the Photrexa viscous. After 30 minutes, the light will turn off, and it's back to your standard post-op PRK drop regimen. So steroid, antibiotic, NSAID if you like. Counsel the patients, don't rub your eyes. There may be a foreign body sensation. There may be some photophobia. They will have a bandage contact lens. So if that comes out, don't attempt to put it back in. Just call the office and get a new BCL. What is this? Expectation on coverage. This might be more for our reimbursement discussion later. Yeah, we're going to wait on that till after a few slides later when we have our reimbursement coverage. Some post-op care. So really it goes back to what's your standard post-op PRK care. So steroid, antibiotic, NSAID if you like, certainly a tears or some sort of lubricating drops, bandage contact lens. If you like to give the patient a script for pain, you know, go right ahead with that, fairly standard. Usually there's going to be that 1 day, 1 week, 1 month post-op visit. When can you start to refit the lens? Certainly after epi remodeling, is that 2 weeks to a month? I hear more of a 1 month time frame. to try to get that, get a more stable refraction and fit the patient with a contact lens. That's also about the time when you may refer them back to their initial optometrist. Certainly following up at the 3, 6, and 12. So as you can see, really standard post-op PRK managed patient. What to expect post-operatively? The cornea will steepen immediately post-operatively, more as a function of the epithelial epi remodeling. So at 1 month, we found that the refraction tends to steepen by a diopter. Very quickly after that, certainly in the 2-month range, but at 3 months, it should have crossed baseline and started to get a little bit flatter. Our studies show that out at 12 months, there's a bit of a refractive flattening of about a diopter and a half. So to say that the cornea will flatten, there will be a little bit of a refractive benefit. The conversation, certainly the goal is more stabilization, but there could be that a little bit of a refractive benefit for the patient. So the status of insurance coverage in the U.S., I think I'll ask Tim McSweeney to guide the conversation.
Thanks, Jason. Yeah, happy to do it. As our insurance coverage has really dramatically increased. When we think about reimbursement, we think about coverage, coding, and payment in order to kind of fit the three-legged stool of reimbursement. The one thing I do want to note is that as of January 1st, 2019, we were awarded a permanent J code, and that's J2787. And then for the procedure, for the cross-linking procedure, it would be 0402T would be the procedure code. So as I mentioned, we'll get into detail, but we actually had very excellent traction in regards to coverage. Our payments have stabilized and the coding has been established. So we do have all three legs of the reimbursement stool. Why don't we go to the next slide? So as I mentioned, in terms of coverage, we actually have over 95%, and pretty much all commercial payers, all of the national payers and most of the large and medium-sized regional payers are now covering cross-linking. So if you'd like to take a look specifically for your state, I'd invite you to go on to Living with Keratoconus or livingwithkc.com, and there you'd see the list of all of the payers, and you're actually able even to download their policies if you want to get into what the PA requirements or the specific requirements are for that particular plan. Why don't we go to the next slide? There we go. And this is the livingwithkeratoconus.com site. So as you'll see, once you go under the insurance information, it will bring a drop-down list of all the insurance that we covered. It'll give you the payer name, the region that particular payer covers. And then if you click on the policy box, which is in the right-hand side, it'll actually give you a live link to that payer's policy. You're able to download. It's always a good best practice to download and keep on file the policies that you see within your practice. Why don't we go to the next slide? So as I mentioned, really good news, really broad coverage, restrictions are very little. That being said, there's always assistance for you in your practice. Right now we have what we call the ARCH program, which is a reimbursement hub. It's a entity that we've engaged in support of Photrexa to help you and your practice with any reimbursement or support questions. They'll actually do the benefit verifications, help with prior authorizations, and as well as prior authorization appeals if needed, as well as claim denial appeals if needed as well. So it's a full suite of offering from a reimbursement assistance standpoint. In addition to that separate entity that we have in terms of the ARCH program, we actually have a patient assistance program that patient assistance program provides free drug for uninsured patients. They must meet financial eligibility. However, the financial eligibility is fairly generous with up to 400% of federal poverty level. And then lastly, we have a bridge program, what I like to call a bridge program. It's to help bridge from when we first launch a product, when there's little coverage to the point where we actually have pretty widespread coverage. This program is not currently used a whole lot right now because of the wide coverage that we do have, but it's for patients who are denied coverage or any out-of-pocket cost. And then it's really restricted for commercial insurance patients, as well as the currently federal healthcare programs such as Medicaid or Medicare are currently excluded from this program. Why don't we go to the next slide?
All right,
Yeah.
I'll jump in here. Thanks a lot, Tim. So we have one slide here quickly on online resources for patients, and everything here you're going to be able to find on livingwithkeratoconus.com. So once you enter that website, there's going to be different links where you can get to our patient brochures, informational videos, insurance coverage information. We have some resources as well as the National Keratoconus Foundation website. So anything on here, make sure you go to livingwithkeratoconus.com and you can access it through that website. And I think that's all we have if we want to hit that next slide. And in conclusion, it's important for patients to be educated about the risk and benefits of cross-linking. That's something they'll talk with their doctor about and learn. Optometrists play a really important part in this as well, especially in the early diagnosis phase, as well as monitoring and after continuing care. Also, financial hurdles have in the past prevented some people from getting treatment, but it's important to note with the rapidly changing landscape, increased number of insurers are covering, and you should be pretty good getting coverage for your patients.